Hello guys, I thought I'd do a quick video about fasteners for the most part. Now, one of the things that came up recently was connecting rod and the big end being out of round. Now, the big end on a rod will be out of round if the torque value is not correct on the fastener. And so, if you were to get stock bolts resized and stock rods resized, and use an aftermarket rod bolt or even the stock rod bolt, you need to make sure that they're torqued to the correct value when they're resized so that when they make them round, they will be round when you torque them onto the motor. Now, if you buy a rod like this pep rod and it's ready to go, if you were to measure this rod right now, you'd find out that it was about 2 thousandths out of round. But that's because the bolts are not torqued to the correct value. Now, if you torque these to the correct value, this becomes within like 1/10 of a thousandth out of round. Now, I could fuss with the value a little bit and see if a pound one way or another, a couple of pounds, would change it to where it's absolutely perfectly round, and that would become my new torque value. And you're thinking, well, no, there's a torque value and that's what you got to stick to. But that's not really the case. What you're really trying to do is make the big end of the rod round. Now, a lot of times you go by bolt stretch as opposed to a torque value, but you can use the torque value and see at what point the rod becomes round if you have a good gauge for doing that. Or you can take one of the rods to a machine shop and just ask them that. You know, what if we torque these at the correct value? Is it round? Do I need to add a pound or two? And you might even take your torque wrench, because every torque wrench can be a little bit different. So yours might be a couple of pounds off, and that could show up as 1/10 or so and out of round on a rod. So a lot of times we will use the torque wrench we're going to be using, and we'll torque it to value, and we'll test it on the rod machine where you have an indicator to tell you how out of round it is, and make sure that we're going to a round value, because that's the whole goal, is to make this round. And when that came up, that made me realize that, I don't know if some of you guys realize, but when you're working on an engine, that's true of a lot of things. If you were to line hone a block, you need to make sure that the caps are torqued down to the correct value. Now, if you're using a stock rod bolt and you're using the stock 90-pound torque value, technically it should be, but they don't always. And if it's line honed to that, then that's what you need to run. Now, if you go up to a better fastener, say you just go up to like an ARP bolt. Now, one of the things with an ARP bolt that you can do is run a little higher load on the cap and line hone the block to that number. So instead of doing 90, you could do like 100 pounds on the fancier bolt and then line hone the block so that it's round, and that becomes your new value. Now, most machine shops, when they do that and they go to something other than the stock value, they'll actually stamp it on the block so that you know what the value is supposed to be on those mains. And if they don't, or if you gave them new bolts and you didn't say anything, and they just torque them to 90, well, then you're stuck at the 90 because that's what they did to make it round. And you could have gone 100 or maybe 110 on a fancier fastener, especially if you're talking about a stud. Now, a lot of times when you're doing these, especially on studs, you're actually getting a higher value. If you were to put in a stud with ARP lube and put the nut on it and even go to 90 pounds, you may actually be loading the main cap more and making it out of round. So sometimes when you do that, if you're not planning on line honing it, you've got to take a gauge to it and see at what value that's actually going to become round, and that becomes your torque value. Because your goal is really to make the journal round in the bore. there's a little bit of taper in the bearing, so the very far edge of the bearing will not necessarily touch at the seam. But the bore is supposed to be round when you hone it. And so you really need to have the correct torque value for making that happen, just like you do on connecting rods. And you need to be aware of this if you start swapping fasteners around to make the motor hold up better, is you can't necessarily just throw a fastener in the block and hook it up and say, well, that'll work. You know, if you add a girdle, if you add cap straps, any of that can change how the cap's loaded, and then you really got to do something about line honing the block in the shape that it's going to be when you run it. Now, one of the things I do sometimes, because I don't always have access to the guy doing the actual machine work, is I will have him write it on the paperwork, but if I have a particular value I want to run, I will pre-stamp it in the block myself so they know that the rods are going to go to this and the cap is going to go to this, and that will help ensure that everybody's on the same page for what the torque value is on the particular fastener that you're running. Because it's not always 90 pounds for a main bolt, and it can, and like I said, even if you change the fastener, 90 pounds can give you a different clamp load as compared to like a factory bolt. Now, that's true on head bolts too, but I did a test years ago on head bolts. I did one side of the bore where we honed it with a block plate, that's a solid plate, that mimics the load of the head. You put in all the head bolts, the plate's rigid, and then you bore and hone the block so that it matches what you're going to do. I did half of the motor with and half of the motor without. And after I ran it a while, there was a slight variance. You could see some slight marks right where the fasteners came in on the block. But it was pretty minor. And it's not as critical on a bore as it is on like the mains or the rods. And so it's really down here that you got to be fussy about what that torque value is going to be, and think about what you're doing. And like I said, the real goal is to make sure that that's round, that the big end of the rod is round. That's why you can't really just throw in an ARP bolt on an existing motor and expect it to be correct. I mean, you're at least going to have to go back and torque it and check that it's round and see if you have to adjust the torque a little bit if you're not going to resize the rod. You at least got to figure out where you are. And the same is true on the main caps, is to make sure that it has come round. Now, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to line hone it, but you have to at least check it and make sure that it's correct, or you can run into bearing problems because the journal area is not round, and so you're having trouble with film thickness and oil flow and all that. So I just wanted to do a quick video and talk about that and make sure that you're aware that you're thinking about what's going on when you're building things. And so, you know, if you're just doing it all stock and it's all already stock and you're not even replacing pistons, you're just putting it together and kind of torquing it and you're good to go. But if you're starting to modify some things on it, think about what you're doing, think about what fastener you're running, because even a bolt will load different than a stud that will load different than a factory bolt. Now, I mean, there are other choices. You could try running a grade 9 bolt instead of a grade 8 bolt, or you could run an ARP bolt. Like I said, there are choices you need to make, and then think about what you're doing and make sure that it's going to come out okay, so that your motor has a nice long life. But I just thought I'd do a real quick video on that and make sure that you're on the right page. And I wish you luck on all your builds, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.